Touch GUI is a really cool way to take the things we've been doing with touch events, where you get some of the different touch phases. It gives you that same functionality, but it ties it directly to GUI items. In this case, I've got 4 Gui Textures set up as buttons, and I'm using Gui Touch to trigger them. And this is the same game, the same little mini game we just saw in Swipe Gesture. If you have not watched the Swipe Gesture video yet, I suggest you do so if you would like a detailed walkthrough of what's going on in the game. In this example, I'm only going to focus on the new elements involving Gui Texture. So let's take a look at how I've rigged this up. What I've got new is a control manager that's been adjusted to include the Touch GUI event, which we'll come back to and talk in some detail. And I've got 4 Gui Textures right here, and that's what these 4 buttons are right here. They're just Gui Textures. And you'd create one of those by choosing Game Object, Create Other, Gui Texture. And here we've got a brand new Gui Texture in the middle. It's by default, it gives you that Unity texture there, so you can see it, otherwise it would be invisible. And let me go ahead and reset that to the middle. And I want to talk a little bit about this and how you position it first, because getting them to be where you'd like is key. I don't know if you've noticed, but look at how these are kind of floating a certain fixed distance. Like you'll notice this is, it's a 64 by 64 texture, and it's floating an exact size off of the edge in the bottom, all right? And if you look here, when I make the window really small, look, it's still floating the same size. This is staying relative to these 2 sides, the right and the bottom, even though the window's changing size. And if I drag this window, it floats and keeps that thing real. That's really important to know how to set that up, otherwise you're going to end up with some problems. So let's talk about that a little bit. I'm going to float the inspector here over top of the game window so I can move this around in real time numerically and you can see what's going on. First of all, under Pixel Inset, width and height is the width and height of this texture. So for instance, the width here is set to 128. If I set that to, I don't know, 300, whoops, I can type. 300, it gets really big and stretched. And if I set it to 12, it's like itty bitty teeny. Just set it back to that, and same for height. Make that 200, it gets really tall. That is just how you set up the size of your texture. And let's go ahead and choose a different one. I will pick, let's go back to those numbers we used in the touch count. I'll pick this 2. Let's give that a big 2. And I'm going to set that to be 64 by 64. You can see it's over top of the cube there. I'm sorry about that. Move it here in a second. So there's 64 by 64. I've squared up the texture. And let me go ahead and get that off there. Yeah. So you can see now that it's square. If I had, made it some other size, of course it would stretch. So this is how you set up the texture to be the right size and the right perspective within itself. And as you saw me just do here with the Pixel Inset, the X and the Y move it. Okay? X there and Y, as I adjust the number, it moves up and down. And what that's doing is coming off of a 0 point. Like if I set this to 0, 0, look at that, it's in the middle of the screen. And remember, we talked about a normalized screen on a mobile device. So this would be 0, 0. This would be 1, like 0, 1. Like X goes 0 to 1 this way, and Y goes 0 to 1 this way. So this here would be 1, 1. So for example, if I moved, in the X, I'm going in that direction. If I move in the Y, I'm going in that direction. And it's important to have a normalized screen because the example I just showed you, like this is still 0, 0, and this is still 1, 1. It gives us a relative scale. In other words, 0, 0 always means the bottom left corner. 1, 1 always means the top right, regardless of the size. And that's how you can make GUI items that float, regardless of whether it's on, say, a 4x5 aspect iPad or a wider aspect iPhone or something like this, where I've got This is 1280 by 720 is the size of the video capture and slightly smaller for this window. So this is even an odd aspect ratio and it's handling it. What we do is use that normalized set of data in order to position the thing. But why is it starting at 0, 0 then in the middle? That's a good question, and it's really, really the key to understanding this whole thing. If you look up here at the transform, I didn't mean to close that. If you look at the transform of this object, it's set at 0.5 by 0.5. Check that out. Whoa, a little trickier than I thought. If I move it a little bit, right, it gets higher and lower. So there's 0.2. Here we are moving up. There's 0.1 and it's getting higher. 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. Now we're in the middle, 0.5, and on the way up. And the same thing, if I say I increase this number, it should go to the right. If I decrease it, it should go to the left. There it is on the other side. So that is really key to understanding how you position this thing. Let me set this to something that makes sense. So let's say, for example, I always wanted the 2 to be floating off the upper right. Let's say I want the 2 to be right here in the corner all the time regardless. You know, like you might do this with a health meter or the player score or a pause button or things like that. So watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to set this to 1 and the Y to 1. That means I've set the position of this object essentially off screen. It's all the way up here off screen. Why would I want this to be off screen? Right? I've set it to 1, 1. I've essentially anchored it off screen. If it were 0.9 and 0.9, it would be almost in the corner. But it doesn't give me quite the precision control that I wanted there, right? What I'm going to do is set this X to 1. I wouldn't leave that 0.9 for now, so it's down a little bit. And if I come back to the pixel inset and I start to apply a negative value, look at that. It's coming back. Right? It's coming back on screen. And if you remember, this thing's 64 by 64. We can see it right there. So if I apply a negative 64, look at that. I've moved it exactly in the perfect amount. So it's just butted exactly up against the side of the screen. So it should stand to reason that if I move this off, 1, I'm now up above the screen. And if I come down an amount, I get it back. And again, if I set it exactly, negative 64, I've set it exactly in the right corner. And let's test this. If I close this and go back into our small view, it did indeed snap. It stayed right there. If I had set it, for instance, if my screen was, say, 720 wide, and I had set this to be 720 minus 64 pixels in, right, to get it to the right spot, it would be way over here, because this screen now is only, what, 300 pixels or something? I'm just kind of guessing. And so it would render way here off screen, but it's not. We've anchored it to the corner and brought it back by that amount. And if we want to pad it, say we wanted a padding of 10 pixels on each side, we could simply put a negative 74 by negative 74. Oops. And that would give us an extra 10 pixels plus the 64, because remember, we're anchoring off the corner. That is how you float something relative to a side of the screen. It would work the same if you wanted it, say, off of this right side. Remember, X is this way, Y is this way. So we've got an X of 1, it's all the way over here. Let's reset the X to 0. And let's set this, the X, to 0. If I can type. And there we go. So it's now right there on the edge, right? And so we don't need an offset because it's already in. If we want that 10 to match the 10 padding, we just add 10 and it insets it by 10, and then the thing flows in the rest. So pretty cool. Let me show you exactly how I placed these as the final closeout to that. I'm going to change this 2 to be, say, the down arrow. And I've anchored off the bottom right. So I'm going to set the X, we're going to need that to be a 1. And the Y is a 0, because the Y is all the way at the bottom. Make sense? Let me reset these values to 0, so I start to get something I expect. we now know that it's off screen. So let's bring it in a certain amount. And see, there it is. I'm starting to see it. I can bring it back by some amount. And as I drag, it goes. Now, once again, I know that it's -64. I'm just going to enter that value in. And because I'm at 0, meaning I'm exactly along the bottom line, then it's going to stand up from there, because we're talking about the bottom of this texture being its source. And -64 brings it in off the side of the screen. We're still anchored to the corner. So to line it up where I did here, I've moved it in 3 equal units clearly. So if I double that, it's -128. One more. 192. -192. Put me underneath. And if I start to move up, remember this, we started at 0, so this will be in the positive direction. If I move up, it starts to move there. And so what I would need is 64. And that makes it line up exactly in that spot. The same thing, if you keep moving it up, this is how you get it to these different spots. So 64 would put it in the middle. Or sorry, 128 would put it in the middle. And you just keep moving up. 192 would align it there. You can set up several objects to be exactly sized the way you want them. Do this, they're going to stay relative to where you're at. Okay, so let me get rid of that, and I'll move on and show you how the control manager works. Quick tip, by the way, this is not iOS specific. You can use normalized screen components or screen coordinates for a PC, a Mac, whatever you want. You can use normalized components for that, which is really cool. Sorry. Not components, coordinates. There we go. Let's look at the control manager now. What we've got is our wait for move, where we were sitting here looking for our up, down, left, right. We have a Touch GUI event, and that is just like all the other things we've been finding in device. Here it is, Touch GUI event, okay, right there. So you can add that in, and I've chosen to drag here the touch button up, for instance. The GUI button up. I just drag that right in there. And that tells this Touch GUI event which GUI object to pay attention to. All right? We want specifically that one and only that one. Here we could filter by a finger ID. You know how this works. I've shown you this in other examples. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to allow any finger to touch. Because what this would be is you would have to have had a touch event that identified the finger and then have it say move onto this object. So this would allow you to filter so that only certain fingers that were doing certain things could activate a button. In this case, I will let any finger work. And I'm only going to look for a touch began that touches this button. That's all I want. I just want a touch began, and when that happens, I'm going to fire the move up. In this case, I'm using the up button. You could also look for the moved, the stationary. For instance, if you started a touch event somewhere else, the finger moved over top of this button and stopped, you would get a stationary event on top of this object, right? Or if it came up here and ended on top of the object, you would get this event, and so on. So, or you were touching it and now you're no longer touching it. This is kind of a new event than not touching. So you can use these events just like we did back on the touch event action. Pretty cool. You should be familiar with these by now. And then we store the results. Same thing. We can store the finger ID of what touched us. We can store the hit point that we were touched on, all that sort of thing. I don't need to store any of that information for this. I just want to know the button was touched, or to know this Gui texture is touched because it's behaving like a button, and then fire off this event. And that's all I need to do. And I'm going to let it check every frame because I want this to be active all the time. So the same thing. I got one for button down, fires the down. I've got one here for button right. I've got one here for button left. They're all doing the same thing and just firing off that specific event. Let me just touch on, you're doing this every frame. GUI elements can be pretty expensive on a mobile device as it is. So you don't want to get too nuts with this. You know, don't make a ton of these. You know, balance what you do here with GUI elements against performance. As you develop, always be checking performance. It's just something you always need to do on any mobile device. Well, any game, actually. We fire off the events, and then we do we call out send events to the die. And if you remember, I'll just touch on it. I'm not going to go in deep because we went over it a lot in other videos. But you remember here, we fire off this event, which then does the iTween rotate and move and moves the camera. That is how the buttons get linked up to the die, which is doing that. And if you remember, the die is checking for doing the raycast and all that kind of stuff we talked about in the last example. That is how you position Gui Textures as cool elements that will stay where you want relative to the screen size. And it is how you use a GUI, where's it at? Touch GUI event in order to add a whole lot of cool touchy-feely activity to it. Let's see how that works on an actual mobile device. This is the minigame running with our Touch GUI objects right here. And all 4 of them are active, and they pop in and out of the active and inactive state, depending upon whether they're in the move or in a fall, in a place where you wouldn't want them to respond for the player. And if you touch them during that time, nothing happens, which is what you'd expect. And they respond in every direction to basic touch.